Welcome to this video in which I will begin a discussion of the Jungian unconscious, its relation to consciousness, which I have discussed in a little more detail in another video, and especially make first attempts to discuss the rootedness of the individual ego, so consciousness, in the unconscious structure that functions as a sort of ecosystem in which consciousness can grow, as we will see throughout this video. I will also make first advances into mentioning the influence that the individual conscious ego can have on the unconscious structure on this level. I will also speak about the self a little bit, finally. We started to speak about this last time. I will just briefly, I will start recapping what I spoke about in a video that I would think of preceding this video in some way, not necessarily, you know, you can watch videos in between, but I would suggest you, well, I assume some understanding of concepts that I used in the previous video and this one. So we have last time discussed that we can think of the conscious realm, so consciousness or ego, the ego, or identity, as I like to call it sometimes, as a structure. That's the first point. So a network in which certain elements are connected into a coherent set under what I refer to, or I think Jung refers to as well, a conscious determinant, so an ego determinant. A German word would be Determinant, which basically just means that it has the power to determine the meaning, in this case, of the structure as a whole. So it really provides, and this is a core feature of the ego, it provides the framework or the axis, we spoke about the axis, under which the entirety of the network is understood, or it's structured by it, let's say, for lack of a better word. We have discussed that the ego or consciousness is characterized by being structured in a narrative continuum. By continuum, I mean specifically that it has a linear structure, that is, its individual components may not individually have any self-evident linear function. They're just nodes in a network, but because of this structuring center, they are compiled into a linearity from the perspective of the narrator, and this narrator is the person, is what we then call the subject, the individual. Okay, maybe not the subject, but the individual. And this narration, although not entirely deliberate, so it's not like I go and I'm like, okay, this is me, and then that's actually me. You know, sure, I can do that, but that will only cover an aspect. Instead, those elements within this network are more or less logically, I would say, connected into under the header of this dominant, which has a function that I am not entirely conscious of, but that I can become conscious of under certain, oh sorry, I used consciousness in another way this time, phenomenally conscious, so I can recall them technically, but like I don't think about it all the time. You know, I don't think about what last time I gave the example, I think, of bamboo. I don't think about the significance of bamboos for this, in this grand narrative that I have of myself all the time. Okay, maybe it will become clearer what we mean by this if we contrast it with what we mean by the unconscious, the Jungian unconscious. So, okay, first of all, if we understand consciousness, i.e. the ego, as a structured entity that is linearly organized along a continuum with a central axiom that we refer to as the conscious dominant, which is not, you can think of it more, think of it in terms of, like a kingdom, whatever, It has a certain, it reigns, a conscious dominant reigns for a certain amount of time, but it doesn't reign permanently and it doesn't reign unchallenged. It's not dominant without being challenged. And this is a consequence of what I said previously, that the linearity and the continuity is dictated upon the entire structure by that dominant, because that's the interpretive framework, the dominant framework in that time. But that doesn't mean that there's no other, applicants, if you will, for that position. It doesn't mean also that all these applicants are necessarily in any given moment possible to be recalled, or that I, as the holder of the one that identifies with those aspects of this grand narrative foremost, is able to recall all of these aspects all the time. But this is fundamentally not what Jung identifies as the unconscious, okay? And I'm a bit more radical, I guess, than others that pose that Jung also retains aspects of Freud's unconscious, which he does, fair enough. The personal unconscious, as some call it, what's his name? Kastrup, Bernardo Kastrup, Jungian scholar, retains, for example, the notion of the personal unconscious in Jungian metaphysics, so that there is this aspect of repressed memories. I still maintain, I would argue that would have to be situated within consciousness. In fact, as I said last time, I would argue that everything always is situated in consciousness from the perspective of consciousness. And there is a place where Kastrup also quotes Jung on that, where Jung also says that, in fact, if we speak of the unconscious, it's basically arbitrary, because we can always only speak of the unconscious in terms of the conscious perspective we have of it. But that is not what we want to speak about today. Today, we want to get a bit speculative, or let's say metaphysical. When we think of the Jungian unconscious, especially in terms of what he then terms the archetypes, and I don't want to get into archetypes in specific, so forget everything you ever heard about archetypes and Jung, okay? You may have heard about perversions of the perverted analyses of the archetypes. That is, people claiming they're looking at archetypes while they're actually looking at historical data that may vaguely be associated with what Jung in some contexts termed archetypal structures. But that's not necessarily corresponding to the, let's say, intention we have here, or I have, speaking of myself in the third person, I have here, which is to understand the structure of the psyche, the structure in which identity can arise, and not specific historical unfolding, which we can also speak of another time. I may do that and look at specific archetypes. Erich Neumann wrote a very long book on the Great Mother. He intended to write a book on the Great Father, which he didn't, because he died. or the great, der große Einzelne, as it were, the great one. Okay, anyways, we'll speak of something else. We'll speak of the land in which the ego can grow, let's say. Okay, so the structure in which anything is possible, according to Jung, in which psyche as the expression of identity becomes possible. Okay, and that structure, really, I want to give you a metaphor again. So in this video that I referenced a couple of times about the ego, I spoke about, or I suggested to you to think of the ego in Jungian terms as a town. So a town that grows around a town hall that's in the center, from which the town's daily business is administered. If you think of this town, you have to admit that this town exists in a certain context, okay? And the town's daily business arises in relation only to that context, okay? It doesn't exist as an isolated entity somewhere in the void or whatever. There is no void, if you will, if it comes to the growth of a town or the growth of the ego. Identity does not grow in the void for Jung. It does not grow as it were, on a blank slate. At least not necessarily. And at least not, let's say, ultimately. This is a point of contradiction where you could argue that the ego could possibly turn away from what I'm about to say, but let's get to that in another video, if I remember. But for now, what we want to imagine is that the town as a settlement is dependent on, I will give you two examples, but on a lot of factors that precede it. Factors, I will give you the two examples, topography and climate, okay? So there are, across the earth, a lot of topographies and a lot of different climates, but ultimately there is a limited number, and we're just going to assume that there's a limited number of topographies and climates, and they're interconnected, apparently. Miraculously, topography and climate are interwoven, but there are a limited number of those factors that express across this planet Earth, and additionally, and this is an assumption I'm going to make to illustrate my metaphor. Additionally, each factor of these sets, of this, we have a set, that set is topography, and the set has elements, let's say arbitrary number, 10, and these 10 elements are, in any representation of that set, all elements of the set are present. So you will not get a place on Earth in which not all elements of topography are present. What varies is the extent to which they're present. Okay? So this is to say that, I don't know much about topography, but let's say you have hills and flatland, okay? Anywhere you go on Earth, in our assumption, in our, assumptive network, whatever the right term is, in any place you go, you have flatland and hills to some extent. You may only have 1% hills, hilliness, to be more explicit with the reference to Plato, hilliness, and 99% flatness, but nonetheless, you will have some hilliness and some flatness, okay? And same goes for climate. Okay, so if I was to give you now a definition of what Jung understands as the collective unconscious, or I would say as the unconscious per se, because we're disregarding the personal unconscious since it's always subjugated by consciousness, as is everything, of course. But if I was to give you a definition of what we're talking about, we would say that the unconscious is the ecosystem in which consciousness unfolds. So it's just as saying, it's the fabric. No, that's not true. It's not the fabric out of which cloth is woven. Instead, it's the let's say the machine, okay, the machine by which you can create your cloth. You can shape it. If we have this painting, it's created on a certain canvas, and the unconscious is the canvasness of that canvas, of that painting, okay? It's not the color, and we'll get to the color outside, but it's the structure, the frame, the canvas, whatever you want to think of. It determines, to some extent, what can be represented. Not entirely, but to some extent. And here comes the crux. And it's complex. It's not one-dimensional like a canvas, okay? That's also why I gave you two sets with multiple elements. Topography, climate. What's now very important to note is that in each place on Earth where a town can grow, the specific topography, so the constellation of elements differs. So you may get two places that are constellated exactly the same. So you may go from where I live to where you live and notice that it appears that every topographical element in this 10 element set is precisely the same. You can now ask, is that true or not? The response will be probably doesn't really matter, because if on the surface it looks the same, it's pretty much irrelevant if it's the same or not. For the construction of a town, 99% congruence is enough, probably. So, and this is important because your ability to construct a town, the structure of that town is going to depend on the topographical prerequisites or topographical conditions in which that town is constructed. And since these differ in different places, each town may differ. It's not saying that each town differs entirely. It's simply to say that if they were to fill the entire template that the topography affords them, they would be different. They would be unique. Okay, that is I think that is the presumption. Okay? It's like you have two piano players and you train them to the same skill set, so they're exactly the same. And then they play on two different pianos. I don't know anything about pianos, but like a cheap piano and a very expensive, $100 piano and $1 million piano. Those two pianos are going to sound different, even though they have the exact same set of skills. And the same applies to topography, and the same applies to the conscious-unconscious interaction, intersection even. Okay? What is important, two things are important, 2 points are important. First, topography can be shaped. think of the climate crisis, the changing climate of the Earth, which is directly interwoven with the change in the structure of the Earth. You know, we live in the Anthropocene, is that how you say it? Anthropocene, where humans directly, and I suppose you, again, I don't know anything about this, but you would say directly and indirectly shape the Earth, you know, directly by building houses, by cutting down trees, by mining natural resources and digging into the Earth. And it changes the appearance of the Earth. And indirectly, with the cascade of effects that has in terms of carbon emissions and all that. Okay, so there is a direct and indirect effect that people exercise on the landscape, on the topography. And so there is a direct and indirect effect that consciousness, the ego, exercises on this topography that it's situated in. If you build a town, the nature of the topography that you situated in changes, you know, directly and indirectly. What this means is that the structure of the unconscious in Jung that so many people always think of as fixed and, you know, and a priori, and here I'm gonna say just a side note on people that say the unconscious is a priori and so on, unchanging, the collective unconscious and the archetypes with it. I think for something to be a priori, it doesn't necessarily have to be unchanging, right? You can have something that is, you know, that you are born into, but that you can still shape, okay? Although, you know, we were all, you know, as it were, manifested somehow on this earth. You know, humans came to this earth, developed from evolution. Now we're on this earth. The earth preceded us, but did it, you know, did it really? The earth that we now know didn't precede us. It will be our successor, it will come after us. But it will precede future humans. So again, it'll be an a priori structure, but it will still changeable. And the same goes for, in my opinion, and in my reading of Jung, for the archetypes. The same goes for then the, you know, the collective unconscious in its structuring element. We'll get to other elements, but in its element that gives structure, in which the conscious ego unfolds, in which consciousness takes root, as it were. At some point I'll have some figures. I have some figures to illustrate this. On this tool, I just don't really know how to share them. So there is an element where consciousness shapes the unconscious on two levels. Again, it shapes the topography of the village that I exist in, but that means it has long-lasting, long-term effects on the topography at that certain place, even after that village is gone. And you know what that means? It means, okay, this now gets a bit abstract, my metaphor has hit its limits. Because all sets that exists across towns, okay, are comprised of the same elements, the same 10 elements, okay, as we said in our metaphor. Each effect on these elements in a specific jurisdiction, as it were, exercises an effect on all other elements, on the set as a whole, on the meta set. Here we can't avoid to become very abstract. Let's say a specific change in the carbon dioxide emission in my hometown has an effect on the composition of the forest in your hometown, and that's and that the magnitude of that effect is determined by of course by multiple factors, but it's I think fundamentally determined by the severity of what you do. If you emit over a very long period of time a little bit of carbon dioxide, it may have similar effects to if you emit a lot of carbon dioxide in a very short amount of time. I would argue. I'm not sure if this is correct in terms of climatology, but it seems to be correct in terms of the structure of the collective unconscious. And what is also important to note here is that the disposition of your topography determines how much influence you can exercise on a certain element in the set. So if you have, let's say, you live in an area where you have 99% forest, and I'm not saying that other areas can. I'm not saying there's a finite number of forestness or something. I'm just saying that since you have this very high, as it were, connectivity to that element in your set, which means you have a high translatability on the, it's called a meta set, and thus that meta element, you can exercise greater influence on this. I'll have another metaphor for this later, which is concerned with roots. I would now like to close by saying that, by again noting that the constitution of this topography and the topography in itself is determinant or shapes how an ego can express. Okay, that doesn't mean two egos can't be the same, as I said, but it shapes how it can express. And I want to also note that it also expresses the limits to which an ego can unfold in its development. It's clear that we develop. I'm not denying, in all my rage against the self, the Jungian self, not against any particular self. I'm not denying that there is something like self-development. I don't like individuation for multiple reasons, but I am not denying that the ego develops. The network, the weights between the units within that network shift. That has an influence on there's migration, there is growth in the town, and so on. So, but we'll get to that in other videos. What I want to note in closing is that since different towns have different resources based on the composition of their topography, that are determined by those resources are determined by the composition of their topography. Engagement in trade between those towns will result in the, let's say, increase of the access to certain topographical resources that haven't been there before. This is probably not the right terminology, but what I'm trying to say is that the encounter with other conscious egos, in fact, that is to say other people, is one way of growing one way of going beyond or transcending the limits of the topography, or the limits that the topographical structure, the ecosystem of your or an individual's unconscious provides them or gives them. Okay, and this is one way that the unconscious acts upon the subject, or that the subject encounters the unconscious in Jung's thought. And this doesn't, okay, this to clarify, this doesn't have to be another person. There are other ways that we'll get to, but in my metaphorical framework for today, this was the most self-evident one, because these topographical structures have, so the, you know, let's call them by their names, the archetypes, have a certain autonomy that we'll get to. And yeah, just maybe to make that clear, because I've been speaking in abstract terms until now, and then I'll close this video. The topographical structures that we spoke of are what Jung refers to, are one aspect of what Jung refers to as the archetypes. So they are lines along which unfolding or development is possible. Differentiation, as Jung says, differentiation. Conscious ego development, okay? Lines along which that's possible. If the term grid wasn't preoccupied by Lacanians to connote the symbolic realm, I would say it's the grid, but I don't. Also because a grid is quite limited and this structure isn't. Anyways, with this I will close. I've now left open the question of the self, but we will get to that next time or in other videos, and yeah, looking forward. Thank you.